Yeah, you are live now, Gagarin.
Live. Good morning, all, for helping in Anekdhara's spiral efforts at National Building.
You have to give your video. You have to on your video.
Are we live?
Yeah, we are live.
For helping in Anekdhara's spiral efforts at National Building. Again, good morning, all of you, for helping in Anekdhara's spiral efforts at National Building.
Your video is not live, not being shown. Yeah, now ready. Now, yeah, fine. Now it's fine.
Sorry, good morning, all of you again. As I told, we are in the process of nation building. Our efforts must be huge, as caste is the capstone IED, I call, that many Indian engineers, masons, and intellectuals love to embed in the foundation of the building called Indian nation, so that it keeps wobbling as the construction continues, at times cluelessly. Verily, the Indian caste question is damningly dirtier and more puzzling than the ocean stables. From the Buddha to Bhakti saints, to the foreign fledgers, to Phule, to Periyar, to Ambedkar, many Herculeses valiantly tried to clean the caste origin stables. They cannot be in vain, though caste, energized by the eternal religion, like the Puranic Raktabijasura and the modern sci-fi blurb, adopts itself to all changes and grows from strength to strength in weakening our nation. That is why Ambedkar said, turn in any direction you like. Caste is the monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform. You cannot have economic reform unless you kill this monster. Raising the question, what caste has done to India, he declared, caste has completely disorganized and demoralized Hindus, preventing common activity. It has prevented the Hindus from becoming a society with a unified life and a consciousness of its own being. Dr. Ambedkar was at his caustic best when he castigated caste. I quote, the effect of caste on the ethics of Hindus is simply deplorable. Caste has killed public spirit. Caste has destroyed the sense of public charity. Caste has made public opinion impossible. Virtue has become caste-ridden and morality has become caste-bound. There is sympathy, but not for men of other castes. There is appreciation of virtue, but only when the man is a fellow caste man. My caste man, right or wrong. My caste man, good or bad. It is not the case of standing by virtue or not standing by vice. It is a case of standing by or not standing by caste. There cannot be a more degrading system than the caste system. It is a system which deadens, paralyzes, and cripples the people from helpful activity. Both Periyar, forced to eat from garbage, and Ambedkar, being denied even water, were the victims of this vicious caste system and call for its annihilation. Some smartly summoned Swami Vivekananda in defense of caste, who held the original quality-based caste system was a natural order, but caste's degenerated form on the principle of birth is bondage. But isn't Swamiji for caste annihilation when he hoped that at some point there would be no separate castes? Fortunately, our November webinar is on Swami Vivekananda and V Govinda Krishnan Avargal, who wrote the insightful book, Vivekananda, the Philosopher of Freedom, will definitely elucidate on Swamiji's incisive idea. I quote, no religion on earth preaches the dignity of humanity in such a lofty strain as Hinduism, and no religion on earth treads upon the poor and the lowly in such a fashion as Hinduism, unquote. Therefore, it is felt that there cannot be a legitimate lie, there cannot be a healthy disease, and there cannot be an ideal gender disparity. And there cannot be an acceptable hierarchical order of human beings, either the congenital polio varna or its immoral HIV offspring caste. Both are inherently infirm and must be destroyed root and branch, as per the clarion call of Periyar and Ambedkar. In fact, a classic example of how caste blinds even the great persons like Lokman Tilak can be seen in his idea of education of women and non-Brahmins as loss of nationality. My God, educating 95% of Hindus amounts to loss of nationality. Can there be more atrocious idea than this? The same mindset is visible in the former Hathras Sardar BJP legislator Rajiv Pehlwan and his upper caste men support to the gang rape and murder of 19-year-old Dalit girl accused. The BJP Godra MLA saying the rapists are Brahmins having good sanskar. And the same from all the people cutting across party lines. Really, strong opposition is also seen. For example, Swami Prasad Maurya demanding a ban on the objectionable portions of Ramcharitamanas. Because of the sad situation, Dr. Ambedkar thundered, you cannot build anything on the foundation of caste. You cannot build up a nation. You cannot build up a morality. Anything that you will build on the foundation of caste will crack and will never be whole. Unquote. It is in this background of despair I am given the unenviable task of introducing briefly the enviably expansive work of today's speaker, Ms. V. Geetha. Geetha is a feminist activist, writer, teacher, orator, historian, translator, and editor from Chennai. She graduated from Stella Maris College and studied MA English in Madras Christian College, Chennai, and again MA English in the University of Iowa, USA. Presently, she is the editorial director, Tara Books. Geetha mainly writes on issues related to caste, gender, education, and civil rights. Carrying out research on the nature and proliferation of NGOs in Tamil Nadu, she has set up the Federation of Women's Groups in the state. She authored, co-authored, edited, and translated about 40 books in Tamil and English and published hundreds of articles. She is a frequent contributor to the Economic and Political Weekly, Seminar, the Vaya, Caravan, Scroll, etc. Her latest book is Bhimrao Ambedkar and the Question of Socialism in India. Geetha was an adjunct faculty, Asian College of Journalism during 2003 and 2012, occasional teacher, the school Krishnamurti Foundation of India, Chennai. And as part of her extramural teaching, she has been passionately organizing Let Us Read Ambedkar in 6 to 10 sessions since 2015. She was consultant for Tamil Nadu Sarva Siksha Abhiyan during 2007 and 10. Formerly member executive committee, the Indian Association of Women's Studies, and she has been active in women's movement since 1988. Surely, Ms. Geetha will introduce us to new insights about Periyar and Ambedkar and the caste question. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gagnon, for that extremely tone-setting introduction. You've made my job fairly easy by setting the mood for today's talk and for that very generous appraisal of my work. I want to start with a few remarks on my choice of title, but let me share my screen before I do that. So this is a photograph that many of you must be familiar with because this is part of the invitation that was circulated with regard to this talk. And I would like to sort of look at this photograph a little closely As you can see, there are these two stalwarts of the anti-caste movement in India, clearly enjoying a lighter moment, laughing. But there's also great affection in the looks that are being exchanged here. It's not that Periyar and Ambedkar knew each other for several decades, but they did know of each other's work for a long time. So if you look at Babasaheb Ambedkar's references to the Tamil non-Brahmin and self-respect movements in Bashkrit Bharat and in Janta, you'll see that he and his constituency were keenly following developments in the southern state. And from as early as the mid 1920s, the newspapers that and the weeklies that Periyar started featured information on anti-caste practices in the Bombay province. And it was Periyar's Kudiyarasu, the weekly that he began in 1925, which featured a translation of Annihilation of Caste as soon as it was published. But Ambedkar was known to Periyar and his movement even earlier, and the only English journal that the Tamil self-respecters started, Revolt, featured information about the Mahat Satyagraha. So there was a lot of give and take between the two regions, which witnessed powerful anti-Brahmanical and anti-caste movements. But as individuals, the two men had an opportunity to meet only in the 1940s. So when I say radical comradeship, I don't quite mean just a personal friendship, which undoubtedly there was, but also that these two men shared a world of ideas to do with equality and justice. And that shared universe was a very rich and layered one. And their shared ideals did not mean that they saw eye to eye on all issues, but it did mean that both of them envisaged a very distinctive future for the Indian Republic. Being active in the late colonial period, from Periyar from the 1900s and Ambedkar from the 1920s, both of them envisaged a future that was quite distinctive from those kinds of dreams that others had for India, especially the nationalists on the one hand and the socialists on the other. Not that they diverged from these other dreams in all respects, but they left their own stamp on the kind of future that they imagined for this republic. And it is in that shared vision that I find a certain radical component. And the comradeship that sustains this vision is at the level of the intellect, is at a philosophical level, and most of all at an ethical level. So, which is how I would like my title to be understood. So now I'll go straight to my talk. Just a second. So here we are. I want to start with this slide, which is just a collection of names of organizations that were active across India from about the last quarter of the 19th century. And they all sort of show us the names of these organizations which challenge the caste order as it existed in late colonial India. And you'll see that some of them are perhaps more familiar than others. SNDP Yogam and Sadhu Jana Paripalana Sangam are from Kerala. The Hindu Free Thought Union, Self-Respect Movement, and the Madras Secular Society, the Non-Caste Dravidian Federation are from the Madras Presidency. Depressed Classes Mission, centered in Bombay but had its branches all over. The Matua movement was from Unified Bengal, Satyashodak Samaj from Maharashtra, the Adi Hindu movement from Punjab and the United Provinces, and the other movement from Punjab and also from the United Provinces. So I just wanted to sort of open up my discussion of Periyar's and Ambedkar's radical comradeship in the context of a history that's not often given the due it deserves. So this is the history of anti-caste thought, which deserves to be placed at the same level as nationalist thought and socialist thought, but which is seldom granted that importance or significance. It's part of the same historical context which caused nationalism to emerge as a popular ideology and which propelled socialism into existence, not just as part of what Indian socialists wish to advance by way of politics, but also as part of a world historical movement towards socialism. It seems to me that anti-caste thought emerging out of anti-caste practices of these various organizations stands to be granted the same significance as we would grant socialism and nationalism. And I think one may not be able to understand Ambedkar's and Periyar's radical comradeship if we don't have a brief understanding of what were these anti-caste worlds and how might we mark their significance for modern Indian history. So here are some photographs, again some familiar names, and you'll see that, of course, the first and most powerful anti-caste cosmos was built by Mahatma Jyotirao Phule and Savitri Bai from Bombay province. But there were other worthy notables across the Indian subcontinent, and you'll see their names and their dates. Some of them are perhaps more familiar than others here. Not many of us might perhaps know of Gulchand Thakur of Bengal, but there was a very strong upsurge of the Namshudras in that part of India, and a questioning of the caste order, and an affirmation of a distinctive religiosity and day-to-day practices. Ayotidas is perhaps more familiar now than he was some years ago, thanks to the work of Tamil scholars. Narayanaguru and Ayangali are likely to be known to most people. Periyar, of course. And then I think some extremely important figures from the north, and amongst whom I would like to sort of spend some time with Bhadan Bodhanand, who converted to Buddhism fairly early in the 1900s and who was actually Ambedkar's Pali teacher as well. And he was part of the Adi Hindu movement associated with Swami Achyutanand from the United Provinces, and a theorist and a thinker in his own right. Then there's Manguram, who has a very interesting history. He was away in North America for a while, was familiar with the politics of the Ghadar movement, the left movement that started in the west coast of North America. But he returned to India, and then he started the other movement amongst the Dalits of Punjab. Mahendra Karan, one of the earliest scholars and anthropologists of Bengal, who wrote on the Port community. Bhagireddy Varma and Venkata Rao, two of many stalwarts from Telangana, Andhra. And this clearly is not a very comprehensive list of names or organizations. I just wanted to sort of put together a few names and a few places so that we get a sense of just how widespread anti-caste assertion was, so that we don't sort of demote it to a footnote to a larger story about the making of the Indian nation, but also grant the importance of the nationalist imagination as it was outlined by these various anti-caste movements. So that's what I wish to do. I also want to call attention to certain other individuals and the efforts that they pioneered. Many of them are from the so-called Savarna caste or from the upper Bahujans, who were sort of troubled by the caste question and who undertook a range of measures to ensure that the so-called untouchables might access education and employment. Leading amongst them was Shahu Maharaj of Kolhapur, and of course Sayaji Rao Gaikwad from Baroda, the princess, and another very, very interesting man, Vittal Rao Shinde, who started the depressed classes mission. And at one point, the largest number of children from the Dalit communities had studied in school started from the depressed classes machine. And interestingly enough, two men from the Arya Samaj, Swami Shraddhanand, who's often associated with an upsurge of Hindu assertion and assertion of Hindu pride, but equally the Swamiji was very committed to the destruction of caste. And he was one of the few who endorsed a breaking of endogamous barriers from within the Arya Samaj. And he was someone Dr. Ambedkar held in esteem. And he quotes him at length in his important book, What Gandhi and Congress Did to the Untouchables. And I think it was men like Shraddhanand who drew a number of Dalits into the Arya Samaj in the initial years of that organization's existence, Subsequently, many of them left the Arya Samaj to found organizations of their own. But I think Swami Shraddhanand's name should be sort of remembered in this context, just because he had a very robust critique of the caste order, and quite different from, say, those advanced by men like Savarkar and the Hindu Mahasabha. The Swamiji was committed to the breaking of endogamy in a fairly sort of straightforward manner, in a way that you don't get from these other Hindus who were interested in unifying the Hindu community so that they could stand up to what they perceived as the threat from Muslims and the Muslim League. While Shraddhanand shared in some of these ideals, he also had a far more robust critique of caste. And then the redoubtable Sant Ram, of whom the historian Charugupta has been writing, who invited Ambedkar to deliver a talk which was finally never delivered before the Jatpat Todak Mandal, but who also was a Bahujan and an anti-caste activist in his own right, a popularizer of ideas in Hindi, and who was invited by the Tamil Nadu anti-caste activists at some point. So I think these are all important developments that you see unfolding from the late 19th century and well into the 1920s and 1930s. And it is in this context that I would like to place the life and work of Ambedkar and Periyar. And before I go to these two men, I want to sort of spend a brief amount of time talking about what made for this questioning of caste across the Indian subcontinent. It's not that caste has never been questioned. Clearly, depending on the kinds of histories that we are familiar with, we are likely to detect a sustained questioning of the caste and the Varna orders through history. Sometimes these are direct critiques, at other times they are indirect. Sometimes they led to movements, at other times they remained at the level of thought and argument. So I'm not going to go into that long history, but I'm going to look at what made for this widespread questioning in the so-called modern period. And one thing is, of course, the larger changes that this period witnessed. And I put down a list of changes here, and I don't want to read them out, but I just want to point out that I think the mobility that was possible, which was also because of some terribly tragic outcomes in the economy, the changes that befell agriculture, for example, and artisanal industries, it made for mobility and also sort of widened the number of people that faced poverty and penury and unemployment. But it also meant that people could escape the bind of caste-based occupations. And you see how that worked for, say, a community like the Shanars and Nadars of Tamil Nadu. And equally for the Dalits who left these shores to go and work elsewhere, while they were sort of victimized by the totality that was a plantation system. Many of them also found ways of working with that, returning back to India, to buying land, to setting up schools and so on. So there was a kind of pricing apart of caste and occupation. And then, of course, education by the missions, by the missionaries, and following that by Hindu nationalists, especially during the Swadeshi movement, by the British government, and by the Dalits and the Bahujans themselves, the starting of schools and hostels, which opened up educational opportunities, with some of them actually making it to the level of the university. And then the expansion of the world of print, which meant that anyone who could read could actually read texts that they were not even meant to see earlier. So you could actually read the Mahabharata in Sanskrit if you knew Sanskrit, or you could read translations, or you could read texts in local languages about religion. And I think these were all very consequential, especially if you look at the writings of men like Ayotitas or Achyutanand or Phule himself. What the world of print did to their understanding of caste, of the world, of politics. And then equally important, and this is something you find all the anti-caste thinkers calling attention to, equality in the eye of the law. Now, this seldom translated into equality in practice. But as Dr. Ambedkar would remark decades later, equality in the eye of the law meant that you were going to be delivered justice not on the basis of your caste or your location in the Varna order, though it's likely that British judges would consider such arguments, but that as a litigant in the courts, you stood to suffer or enjoy, at least normatively, the same sort of justice claims that someone from another community was likely to advance. So for Ambedkar, equality in the eyes of the law made or could potentially make for a commonality of suffering. And out of that commonality of suffering, it was likely that a new community might emerge.
Ma'am,
So I think
small intervention. Your slides, you purposely not showing them, or because you're
I'm
stuck?
showing them, I'm sharing them. Are they not sharing?
No, we are not able to see.
No,
We
no,
are-
there are no slides for each of my talks. This is a slide that I want to stay with.
no, anti-caste worlds is the slide that you are staying with now.
This you can't see.
Anti-caste worlds, we are able to see that slide.
This one you can see, colonial trade, industry and plantations.
No, 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 no.
Just a second, just a second.
No. And also, you are not in the slideshow mode. You are just in the slide
Yeah,
edit.
can you
Now,
see it now?
yeah, now we can see, but previous slides, all those photos
Okay.
were not
No,
seen.
there was just there was just the pictures before that.
Yeah, if you run
Okay.
through the pictures, maybe people will just 1
This
minute,
one.
1 second. Yeah.
Let me
Right.
just start. So this is how I started. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the
Okay.
slide we are on. Right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So these were the kinds of changes that had taken place in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which made possible the kind of ideas that circulated across the Indian subcontinent. Now, interestingly enough, and this is important because I think it is with regard to these various ideas that Periyar and Ambedkar would differ from their forebears in the anti-caste movements. One is that before Periyar and Ambedkar, many were likely to identify what I call the promises of modernity with English rule and see British rule as better, more even-handed than the rule by the native rulers. This is something that you see across the subcontinent. And when the Prince of Wales visited India in the early 20th century, all the anti-caste movements made it a point to go out on the streets and welcome him, saying that he had guaranteed a better life for them than Indian rulers had ever done. Now, this is a point on which both Periyar and Ambedkar would differ from their forebears. But since many of the first generation and second generation of anti-caste leaders and thinkers saw British rule as salutary, they were not convinced about nationalism. And you see Phule saying this already. So did Achyutanand, so did many others. And their arguments were very interesting. And this is something that Periyar and Ambedkar would pick up, but also take ahead in very interesting ways. What this earlier generation said was that neither political liberty or self-rule would bring about equality and justice within Hindu caste society. And what was important, I think Mr. Gagrin also pointed to this in his introduction, it was very important to uphold the importance of reforming the caste order. And some added to that on thinking about the women's question. This was very much the case with Periyar and Phule, and to a lesser extent with the others. But addressing social reform and the women's question, it was argued, ought to be given the same importance as nationalism. And this is where they differed from Tilak and where they differed from a number of others who felt social reform would follow self-rule or Swaraj. So this is something that we need to keep in mind because these are arguments that both Periyar and Ambedkar would sort of come to from fairly distinctive perspectives. In terms of society and culture, this is what anti-caste activists had to say, again from Phule onwards, that their wide reading and the fact that they could now access Hinduism not just through the primary texts that were available in print, but also through the criticisms that were being advanced by British scholars, by missionaries. So you had the anti-caste thinkers and the movements that they founded relating to Hinduism in a very complex way. There was qualified acceptance, for example. The Adi Hindu movement recognized and endorsed the beginnings of Hinduism in the Bhakti tradition, in Raidas, for example, but they rejected much else. Bodhanand posited a very important role for the Buddha, but rejected the rest of Hindu philosophy. people like Ayotitas did the same, though Ayotitas reread Hindu rituals, especially local practices of faith. So you had a range of ways of relating to what was Hinduism, separating Brahminical rites from local practices, Buddhism from Brahmanism, accepting the Bhakti movement, and so on. But almost all anti-caste activists refused to accept the place that was assigned to their communities in the caste order. This was true of Bahujans as well as Dalits. Bahujans who were part of the Adi Hindu movement also protested the role that was accorded to them. Likewise, Bahujans who were part of Satyashoda. So either they quoted a higher Varna status, saying they were Kshatriyas or Brahmins initially, but they had been downgraded, or many just said, we don't want to recognize a Varna or a caste marker. So you had Ayotitas imploring Dalits during the time of the census, saying, don't return yourself as depressed classes or as Adi Dravidas, but as Buddhists. So you had different ways in which people sought to sort of reject caste. And again, this history is important in terms of what Periyar and Ambedkar would do with this history. And I just want to spend a few minutes with Phule and Ayotitas before I go on to talk about Periyar and Ambedkar, because I think they sort of set the tone for what followed later on. While Phule was generally very warm in his commendation of the higher echelons of British rule, say the collector, or those that were in the legislature, he was very critical of British planters and those who were responsible for the Forest Act, for British traders and so on, whom he felt were despoiling Indian agriculture and moving it away from a subsistence sort of production towards the cash economy, which bode ill for everyone except those who were money lenders and those Brahmins who now stood to buy land. So in his very famous book on what had happened to the peasantry in the Bombay province, The Cultivator's Whipcord, he sort of offers a very nuanced reading of the British presence in the Indian context. And he also sees the peasant and the peasant woman and the Atishudras, or the Dalit workers who work the land, as repositories of knowledge about cultivation and agriculture, who must be taken seriously in any future transformation of agriculture. Ideas which would be picked up much later on and spoken about in movements as different as the All India Kisan Sangh, where Swami Sahajanand would strike a similar tone. And very, many decades later by Kancha Ailaya in his beautiful book for children, Tilling the Land and Turning the Pot. So you have this positioning the peasants as repositories of knowledge. So in a sense, Phule was both part of what the larger world of the anti-caste movements had to say with regard to British rule, but he also brought to it a very distinctive understanding. He was also critical of the imperialist project in a world historical sense. And he was very critical of what had happened to the Aborigines in Australia and to the Native Americans in the United States. And he compared the fate of Bahujans and Dalits to the fate of the Native Americans and the Aborigines. So he had a very interesting internationalist take on the peasant question, one can call it that. Ayotitas, interestingly, from as early as 1907 and 1908, he ran a column called Swadeshi Reform in his weekly Tamilan. And there he criticized Swaraj and Swadeshi, or what we call the heyday of Swaraj and Swadeshi, saying what is true Swadeshi. And we find him also again returning to the question of the economy and talking about what needs to be done to agriculture and to the artisanal crafts. And like Phule, he also positions the artisan and the peasant as a true holder of knowledge and not the Brahmins. And he says, whatever changes you wish to do from a Swadeshi point of view, if you don't pay attention to these areas of human practice and listen to what the peasants and the peasant laborers have to say, you're not likely to advance the cause of Swadeshi, and you need to learn from the whole world. And so it's a very, very interesting take again on his understanding of the nationalist position at this point. While endorsing British rule, he makes this case for an alternative Swadeshi vision. And that is quite curious in the Tamil context, because he also rereads Tamil notions of the landscape, for example, the five landscape notion in Tamil history. And he says this is actually a division that pertains to the whole world. So wherever a peasant is, the peasant is a Vellala. Wherever there are wise men and women, they are Brahmins. So in a very interesting way, he also gestures towards a world historical movement. And that's quite interesting. So when we come to Periyar and Ambedkar, we'll see how they are located both within the Hindu social order as well as they are part of a world historical tendency to think critically about society and economics and politics. So that's the point I wish to make. And then lastly, both Phule and Ambedkar and Ayodhyadas gesture towards an ideal universe in terms of a broad understanding of particular histories. For Phule, it's Bali Raja, and Bali Raja is of course known across Western India as a kind of a mythical king under whom we had seen a very just and good social order. But for Phule, Bali could equally be Jesus Christ, he could be the prophet, he could be even social reformers who are committed to ending caste. So basically, Bali stands for a utopian society. Bali's kingdom is a utopian society. For Ayodhyadas, it was the Buddhist cosmos that signified the ideal society. And this was a cosmos that was not just particular to India, but as he would speak of in his Baudhashrama lectures in Chennai city and in Tamilan, this was something that he felt was worldwide, and he would refer constantly to the kind of reforms that were being made in Burma, in Japan, and to all those in the United States and in Europe who had converted to Buddhism. So they had a sense of a new world that could emerge, which sort of bore this stamp of an anti-caste universe, as well as held within it a utopian sensibility. And I will sort of leave you with that as far as the prehistory of the anti-caste universes are concerned, and go straight to Periyar and Babasaheb. And I think you will see why I wanted to spend some time on the earlier reformers and thinkers, because Periyar and Babasaheb did not emerge out of a vacuum. They had this very rich past, some of which was familiar to them, some of which was perhaps not, but they had something very different to say about anti-colonial nationalism. And they advanced a radical social critique on the basis of which they wanted to rethink the national question. And they also saw utopia not as something that was not possible now, but that you had to do something now to realize utopia. So I'm going to spend some time on each of these issues. Let's start with Periyar, because he was older and he had started public life a decade or so earlier than Ambedkar. And what did the modern movement mean to Periyar? Those that are familiar with his writings know that he was a staunch advocate of rationalism and science. And he viewed both rationalism and science as making for a critical social outlook. It is not simply that you look at scientific truth and then you marvel at it and then you say that whatever we believed in was quite untenable, but also that you use the approach that science undertakes to study society as well. That's one important thing. He also wanted to sort of communicate the fact that let's remember that time is movement. And as we move in time, we are also moving ahead, which means that there is nothing fixed about human life or human history, which meant that the past can be relativized. Whatever existed in the past is not sacred. It is something that time does change, and we need to understand how time has changed it. And if you go to Ambedkar, you see that to him also the modern moment was essentially a revolutionary moment. And like many men and women of his time, he identified that with the moment of the French Revolution and liberty, equality, and fraternity as realizable values, not values which only existed in literature or in bhakti poetry. And in fact, this was his critique of bhakti poetry, that one could only realize values of equality or fraternity in one's relationship to God and in a moment of bhakti ecstasy, but not in social life. So for him, therefore, the French Revolution was an inaugural moment, though in later years, especially in the 40s and 50s, he would say that the Buddha had equally spoken about such values. And like Periyar, he took the movement of history very seriously. When Mr. Gagarin spoke, he spoke of how caste continues to survive time. And Ambedkar was interested precisely in understanding how does caste survive time? What are the historical means through which this has happened, and how might we challenge that history? So, both for Periyar and Ambedkar, the modern moment didn't have only to do with colonial rule, but with modernity as such. And how might one approach that modernity? How might one understand that? So, standing on the basis of these ideas, Periyar would then argue that what would free us from the caste system? What would free us from obscurantism, from beliefs that have no basis? And he would say knowledge. Knowledge is the basis for freedom. Knowledge is the basis for equality. You have to challenge received ideas. You have to challenge what you have been told is the truth. And you have to retain a critical sensibility at all times. As for Ambedkar, he would start from a nationalist critique of the present, especially in his student dissertations, where he quotes with aplomb Ramesh Chandra Dutt and others who saw imperialism and colonialism as compromising India's political and economic sovereignty. But then he wouldn't stay there. He would go on to offer a very radical critique of the social order and untouchability. And for him, therefore, it was important to use the modern ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity as the basis for advancing a critique of Hindu society or the Hindu social order, as he called it. And therefore, for this reason, that unless you criticize the Hindu social order, you can't really hope to do anything in India. Both Periyar and Ambedkar would criticize Indian nationalism as not paying enough importance to the caste question. In fact, both of them moved to that position. Periyar started out working with the Gandhians in Tamil Nadu in the Madras presidency. But even then, for him, nationalism was interesting because Gandhi combined constructive work with non-cooperation. And what was important about constructive work was untouchability, abolition, and temperance. And Periyar was very active on both fronts in the Madras province until the mid 1920s. But subsequently, he parted company with the nationalists, because they were not interested in addressing the question of adequate representation for Bahujans and Dalits in politics and in education and in government service. And he felt that nationalism was becoming a very important modern way of communicating the entitlements of the Brahmin community and thereby keeping the caste order in place. So he felt nationalism was nothing but political Brahmanism. And so he started opposing nationalism from the late 1920s. And he would argue that unless this nationalism accepted the principle of adequacy with regard to representation, and unless it was willing to criticize the Brahmin leadership of the nationalist movement, he would not find nationalism a popular ideal. It was important to rethink nationalism. Ambedkar came to it from a different point of view because he raised the all-important question, what can self-rule or the coming of the free nation mean to Dalits? And as early as 1919, when he offered evidence before the Southborough Commission, he would make this very compelling point. The Dalit has his very self, or her very self confiscated. He or she is not in possession of herself. He or she is enslaved. And a slave, and Ambedkar would argue, quoting Plato, is someone who takes the purposes of his life and the meaning of his life from others. So in such a situation, what could self-rule mean to Dalits? If self-rule had to mean something to Dalits, Dalits would have to be part of the argument about self-rule. And for this, they have to be represented in political society, in political life, be in a place where they can reset the terms of the argument. And for that to happen, everyone ought to recognize that they must be possessed of a criticism of the Hindu social order. So here Periyar and Ambedkar come to more or less the same position. Periyar arguing nationalism and nothing but political Brahmanism. Ambedkar arguing that nationalism is meaningless for Dalits unless Dalits can be in a position to reset the terms of what we understand by the term nationalism. So, and this is where they differed from an earlier generation, as you can very easily see. So, in order to communicate why nationalism is problematic, Periyar and others in the movement that he started, the self-respect movement, and I'll come to that in a minute, they used the newspaper as a means of communication. And this is also where they offered a critique of the Hindu social order of the caste system and why that must be subjected to critique and annihilation before one can think of national freedom. Or if one wanted to think of national freedom, alongside you must think of how you might end the caste order. And why must you do so? So there, Periyar would offer a redefinition of politics itself. Politics has to necessarily include the annihilation of caste. This is something Ambedkar would pick up as well. And this was no negative critique of the caste order. It was also a positive critique in that he would say that what you need in place of Manudharma is Samadharma. And I'll come to all of this in a minute. Likewise, from Ambedkar, you would have politics from the point of view of Dalits. What does nationalism mean if Dalits were to talk about nationalism? And this is where he would differ from Gandhi in a very fundamental manner, a difference that is sort of expanded in his important book, What Congress and Gandhi Did to the Untouchables. But basically saying if nationalism cannot imagine emancipation for the Dalits, it is not true nationalism. And why is it not true nationalism? Because it does not take into account the constitutive inequality of the caste order, and therefore he would present a very strong critique of caste, which he shared with Periyar, but he also had some things to say on his own accord. And he would say that for the Dalits to actually come into nationalism or to any political project for equality and justice, they would have to get away from the Hindus and Hinduism and annihilate caste as such if the Hindus don't join them. And this is important. The Hindus join them and rethink the caste question. There's hope that we can all think together towards a different future. But if the Hindus are not going to do it, the Dalits would do it on their own. And that is the content of annihilation of caste. And what would they then seek to build? They would seek to build a society, an ideal society anchored in the Buddha's Dhamma. So you had Samadharma as an alternative to the society imagined by the nationalists, and you have the Buddha's Dhamma also as an alternative to the values imagined by the nationalists. So Periyar and Ambedkar, this is where they moved away from the early anti-caste tradition, that they wanted to complicate the nationalist question, not simply reject it, by stating that it has to necessarily include the annihilation of caste. And if it doesn't do that, then we'll have to rethink our own relationship to the nationalist question. And why are we saying this? Because this is what the caste system is. Let's understand it in this manner. And from there, proceed to rethink the nationalist question. And alongside that, the socialist question. Because the other players during this period in time, and I'm talking about the 1920s and the 1940s, the socialists were as important players as the nationalists were. So what were Periyar and Ambedkar saying? I'm going to take you through a set of slides where you can read a bit of what they said. I don't want to read it out. I'll just let the slides stay. So this is Periyar criticizing Swaraj in the 1920s. This is an idea that he stayed with till almost the end of his life. And I'm just going to leave this on for a few seconds. So he can see what he meant by nationalism as political Brahmanism. If it left the entitlements of the Brahmin community intact, they would leave their stamp of exclusivity on the nationalist project. And that simply cannot be countenanced. And why cannot that be countenanced? And he gives you this reason. Importantly, he saw the entitlements that the Brahmins sought, but also entitlements that the other castes also shared in, which the Dalits had no access to. So this is what he had to say about the non-Brahmins who would criticize the Brahmins, but who refused to grant equality to the Dalits. And this is from the 1930s. So basically what Periyar was trying to do was to build what we might call a Bahujan Dalit historic bloc. And I use this term in the sense that the Italian thinker Gramsci uses it. It's not a political alliance. It's not an opportunist alliance, but it's a coming together of segments of the population on the understanding that they have very vital issues at stake that they share. And on this basis, they should build a new understanding of public life and politics. So, which is why he spoke about the importance of non-Brahmins also opposing the caste order. Let's move to Ambedkar. This is from what Gandhi and Congress did to the untouchables. This is a text from the 1940s. But these are arguments that Ambedkar was advancing from the 1920s. And he refines them and he systematizes them in this book. And this is on the eve of various reforms being countenanced by the British government. And he is addressing, as he calls it, British lovers of India. So you see Periyar's political Brahmanism is sort of systematized and given a kind of a historical anchor. And Ambedkar introduces all-important notion of graded inequality, that what is important is not only are the Brahmins entitled, but everyone else except the Dalits are partially entitled within the caste order. Dalits are placed outside it. But what does this graded inequality mean? Which means that no one is actually equal to anyone else. And in such a context, what does it mean to opt for a nationalism which does not question graded inequality? So unless you start from the position of graded inequality and look at this new nation that you wish to build, how can you build a healthy, equal, and just republic? So Ambedkar's point was that the Shudras, who are placed at the bottom of the social pyramid, suffer the burden of graded inequality, but then the Shudras themselves look down on the untouchables. So like Periyar, he was also trying to constitute a historic bloc, which is why he wrote a book called Who Were the Shudras? And as he says in the introduction, to alert the Shudras that they have to sort of see that their interests lie in criticizing graded inequality as such, and not just maintaining their position of superiority over the Dalits. And this is his explanation of graded inequality and how it operates at every level. I think what Ambedkar wants us to see, it's not just a negative, repressing kind of inequality. It also is a productive kind of inequality. You're made to love your caste. As Mr. Gagarin read out from Annihilation of Caste, you feel my caste person, right or wrong. My caste is always the best. So I think for Ambedkar, that was a very dangerous sort of argument because it prevented people from seeing that there is something that holds all of us together. And that is where we should all want to be, and not on this sort of graded axis, right? And this was also the arguments that they felt the socialists did not quite understand. While sympathizing with the socialist ideal, and there is Singaravelu, one of the founders of the Indian Communist movement, who wrote steadily and regularly in all the weeklies that Periyar published, and with whom Periyar had a running argument about the economic basis of social difference. There are the Bombay socialists. There you see B.T. Ranadive and Gangadhar Adhikari, people that Ambedkar knew well and with whom he was in touch. He defended some of them in court. But nevertheless, both Periyar and Ambedkar were very critical of the socialists, especially the socialist understanding of the relationship between caste and economic class. And this is Periyar on the Russian Revolution. So basically what Periyar is saying that unless you challenge caste, you can't really seek to build a socialist republic in India, because caste is something that will prevent us from seeing ourselves equally as workers. And he also says the word worker has a specific meaning in India because it also is a word that is held in disdain. Unlike in the West, where the worker might be subjected to injustice and paid badly, but no one doubts the worker's competence. But here, the worker's competence is not what matters, rather, his or her caste identity matters. So, this is his take on Karl Marx. And Ambedkar again says the same thing, more or less, but in a different manner. So you can see how they both moved away from the anti-caste tradition in terms of where they draw their arguments from, their interest in a broad socialist democracy. And again, Ambedkar arguing why we need to take caste seriously. And as you can see, for both Ambedkar and Periyar, a caste worker is someone who necessarily is seen as a menial, a slave, whose competence is not regarded, who is not seen as producing value, which is why we continue to have the kinds of issues we have today, most acutely seen in something like sanitary labor, but we also see it in other trades, which is why the informal sector suffers the manner it does, because most of those working in the informal sector are from Bahujan, the lower Bahujan and Dalit communities, especially women, and their labor is simply seen as valueless and they are seen as doing what they perhaps deserve to be doing. So you can see why Ambedkar and Periyar are so important in this context. So what you then see Periyar and Ambedkar doing, they're essentially shifting the terms of the argument away from a standard nationalist opposition to British rule and a kind of an invocation of the nation. However rich this invocation was, Gandhi did it in certain ways, Nehru in other ways, Patel in a third way, Subhash Chandra Bose in a fourth way, and the socialists within Congress in certain ways. But none of them actually brought to bear on the nationalist question issues to do with caste and issues to do with hierarchy and issues to do with labor. And for Periyar and Ambedkar, what was important was you had to do all of that. And what did it mean to do all of that? You had to build a movement that would challenge these things. And Periyar built the self-respect movement, where he made self-respect the basis for advancing one's claim to equality. So he said not Swaraj, but Swabhiman. So it's not self-rule, but self-respect. And self-respect required each of us to respect ourselves and others, and not just men doing this to each other, but equally women. And Periyar's feminism was extremely radical, and he felt that the relationship between men and women cannot be defined only through marriage or wifehood or child, or women being seen as fertile child bearers, because women bearing children reproduce the caste order. But women must have the right to decide whether they want to marry at all, whether they want to have children at all, the right to contraception, right to education, and so on. And Ambedkar thought about Dalits moving away from this caste order towards a fraternity. And he felt that politics was one way of doing it. There being present in politics, in all levels of politics was one way of doing this. But equally, they would rethink politics itself. So on what basis would they rethink? For Periyar, it was this, that the basis of any kind of change in India has to start with the abolition of untouchability. Because this is something that each of us has within us, and each of us stands compromised. And unless we rebuild ourselves together, we're not likely to do anything different. For Ambedkar, this meant that we become fraternal. And how do you build fraternity? How do you build a different sense of self, Periyar says, and Ambedkar says, how do you build fraternity? And for Periyar, to build meant that you take against God, all religions, but particularly Hinduism, because as he argued, I was born in the Hindu fold, I know it best and I would fight it best, the Shastras and the domination of Brahmins. And he felt that these had to be addressed in their entirety. And for Ambedkar, it meant that you had to have what he called social endosmosis. that we come together as a society and learn and partake of each other's lives. It's not simply just formal equality. We are part of each other's lives for better and for worse. In other words, he would often quote the Bible in this quote, we are each other's keepers. So, but what did this mean in practical terms? For Periyar, it meant a thought revolution and a political society that builds on that thought revolution. So later on, when he challenged Indian nationalism in the 1940s, as it became evident India was going to be free, he called this challenging the demand for Dravida Nadu. But Dravida Nadu was not simply a place. It was not simply Tamil Nadu or the Madras Presidency. It was also a location outside of the caste order and untouchability. It was a place where Shudras and Dalits would experience freedom and equality. And that was a society that you push towards by challenging God, religion, Shastras, and the power of Brahmins. And for Ambedkar, what needed to be done was, this is of course Periyar. This is all that needed to be done if you had to build Dravida Nadu. And this is important to keep in mind because Dravida Nadu is not a physical location merely. In fact, Ambedkar meeting Periyar in the 1940s would joke and say, let Maharashtra also be part of Dravida Nadu. And these are the things that Periyar wrote to bring that about. Different books, a critique of the Ramayana on the one hand, what is self-respect, how did women become enslaved, why is family planning important, and his last speech, which was about the importance of challenging Brahmin hegemony and what he termed was an upper caste Hinduism. And for Ambedkar, political safeguards for Dalits. Dalits have to be present in political society to build the basis for fraternity. And of course, his great interest in what we all understand as constitutional morality. You don't take the cues for your life from Manu Dharma Shastra or from the Puranas, but from the Indian Constitution. And while he had a lot of misgivings about the final shape of the Constitution, he yet set great store by the preamble, which he helped to craft. And as we all know, he went on to chart the Hindu Code Bill, which would allow for a very wide latitude of legal support for gender justice. And therefore, he staked claims in constitutional morality. But at the same time, he gave a very important role to knowledge. You have to continue to critique the Hindu social order and understand how the caste system has survived. And here he gave a lot of importance to the way in which traditionally there was this fight between Buddhism and Brahmanism, and how Brahmanism absorbed the key tenets of Buddhism and recast it, and how that was done in historical period after historical period. It's not that the Buddhists were completely defeated or that the reformers were completely dead, but there was a way in which Brahmanism, with the power of the state, proclaimed itself victorious. And he wrote about it in his important unfinished book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. But he also wanted us to see it as a continuing process. And he saw his own contradiction with Gandhi in those terms, that Gandhi's religiosity might help shore up the caste order, whereas his own critique of Varnashrama Dharma might help disrupt it. So in a sense, he saw Gandhi as somewhere lending credence to the support of Brahmanical ways of thinking about caste. So in that context, he felt that it was important to turn to the Buddha and to Buddhism. And these were, of course, the books that he wrote and the kind of historical arguments that he advanced. So this is what I want to leave you with finally, because I think what's important about both Ambedkar and Periyar is that their anger against Brahmin entitlement, against the Hindu caste order, was an account of what it did to the human person. And they wanted us to understand that, hence their very radical, critical take on caste, what it does to the self, all ourselves, not simply the Dalits and the oppressed, but it makes lesser human beings of all of us. All of us are lacking in self-respect. And what does it do to the Dalit in particular? This is where Ambedkar makes a very important point. And along with graded inequality, it produces enslavement and untouchability. And what does it do to women? Periyar says, it makes them reproducers of the caste family. And how do you then put an end to that. Women must be given the autonomy to decide what they wish to do, which is a position Ambedkar endorses with the legal and constitutional safeguards he wished to build for women. And both of them looked for an ideal society. And for Periyar, it was the idea of Dravida Nadu. And for Ambedkar, it was the Buddha's Dhamma and his own conversion along with lakhs of his followers, which included a smattering of Bahujans as well. This was a way of telling the world that we do not wish to subscribe to the Hindu social order or to be part of it. We want to be Buddhists who are invested in equality and fraternity. So I'll end with that. And thanks very much, Anekdhara, for giving me this opportunity to present my views. I'm sorry if I have overshot my original 45 minutes. Thank you very much.
Gagarin, are you there?
Yeah, my internet is slightly coming and going.
You have to unmute one phone. You have to unmute one phone. Otherwise, we'll handle.
No, in fact, I asked. I have two instruments. One is not working properly and another one is also not working properly. There's double damage, like double engine. Both the engines appear to be failing.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks a lot, ma'am. In fact, it is a wonderful session, and you have brought out in such a nice fashion the way in which both the theorists or prophets have seen the Indian social system, Indian religious system that is supporting Indian social system. And in fact, there are certain questions. Shall we ask? You can even see the chat box.
No, you asked, so that others also will know in the YouTube.
Yeah, because I am a bit surprised whether my voice is proper or not. I am unable to hear my own voice properly in the system.
No, your voice is very clear to us. So please go ahead.
Okay. See, the first issue is, while Periyar was against participating in political process, Dr. Ambedkar called political power as the master key. Is it possible to see them as complementary or contradictory?
I'll take all the questions together. Is that okay? Or should I answer each? How do you want me to do this?
Madam, then you can read the chat box and then clarify.
Yeah, why don't I just do that?
Yeah,
I'll
read and then I'll... chat box.
Yeah, let me just open the chat box. Yeah, okay. Let me start with the first question. Arun Shauri's book on Ambedkar was very critical. Can you kindly deal with the issue? I think Arun Shauri did a very partial, and I'm sorry to use the word, opportunist reading of Ambedkar. Ambedkar's thought world is very rich and layered, and there are also moments of tension in terms of how he understood some of these issues over a period of time. For example, nationalism. His book on Pakistan can be fairly problematic in today's context, for example. So I think it requires a very layered and a contextual reading of Ambedkar, and to sort of see where are his consistent ideas and where are his ideas bound by particular specific circumstances. So I don't want to spend too much time thinking about Arun Shauri's critique. Others have done that better than I have, so I will move on. Many caste apologists claim caste is a social institution independent of Hindu religion. Well, Phule, Periyar, Ambedkar, etc. are cocksure it is religion that's the mainstay of caste. I think the first set of apologists are unable to sort of see themselves as being implicated in the caste system. They see it as wrong, but they see that they personally may or may not be casteist. So they don't want to associate it with Hindu religion because perhaps they are deeply religious as well. Gandhi is, of course, the best example of this. But it's very evident whether you look at the Dharma Shastra literature, whether you look at the philosophical debates, the kinds of tensions that existed between the votaries of Brahmanism as a philosophical system and of the Shramana religions. The tensions largely unfold around the question of birth-based difference and entitlement. So philosophically, if caste is a part of Hinduism, then ethically and religiously also it is a part of Hinduism. So it's only a matter of convenience to distance ourselves as individuals from it that we perhaps make this argument. But I'm not sure it's philosophically or historically tenable. And there are historians who have written about it at great length, as have philosophers. So there is that. In spite of the efforts of both the great men, many others, what is the status of the caste order? Well, the caste order has obviously changed over a period of time. It's not sort of only on the basis of occupations or on the basis of uh, where someone finds themselves at the moment of their birth. But what's important is to understand how is it that we are shuffled along the same pyramid all the time. So if the caste order is a pyramid, then you might occupy a higher or a lower rung, but you're still within the pyramid. And Dalits find themselves outside the pyramid. So what is the logic of this survival? And I think one of the reasons is that it is, of the many reasons, that it is also constructed out of the materiality of everyday life. As the late K. Balagopal used to say, when you start out on life, uh, whether in terms of education or work, you start from where you are. So your tools of production are what your family immediately has to offer you. So if a child is born in a carpenter's family, the chisel is what the child will inherit. The child wants to inherit the mathematics textbook. The child has to fight for it through reservation, through pushing to go to school. So caste is also a question of political economy, and the challenges to caste-based political economy have altered some things, but not the fundamentals. So caste and class are very closely intertwined today. While some amongst the Bahujans and Dalits may be slightly better off in economic terms than earlier, some may even be on the side of, some may even be landowners, some may even be part of the list of Indian entrepreneurs. But basically, they're all within the same triangle. And I think the political economy of caste is a matter that we need to study harder and with a greater rigor. And that might help us understand why caste has persisted as well, because it's built out of such a building block. So Periyar was against participating in the political process. Dr. Ambedkar called political power as a master key. I would say that while Periyar was against participating for his own party in the political process, he did not think that others needed to do so as well. He was interested in the state as a kind of a guarantee of the common good. So the political process was important for him, but he felt that the Dravidar Kazhagam ought to play the role of a permanent critique of society. Ambedkar also felt that was important. In fact, one of the things that Ambedkar wished to do was to found a kind of what he called a settlement house kind of society, which would constantly work in the public sphere, in what we today call civil society, to persuade people to see the injustice of caste and to create a nourishing and sustaining world for Dalits to realize their humanity. So I think both men were very keenly aware that being part of the political process was important, but adjacent, along with that, one needed to do other things. So it was not enough just to sort of deal with the political process alone. As Periyar treated power to Indians as internal colonialism and not North Indian or Hindi domination. No, Periyar sees it as North Indian colonialism, if I might use that word. Brahmin Banya, in fact. But it's interesting because while he saw it as emanating from a place outside of Tamil Nadu, we also know Periyar had followers elsewhere in India as well, and he did go and speak in a backward classes conference in Kanpur. I think for Periyar, North and South were not cultural geographical entities as they were social entities. So if you were on the side of Brahmanical Hinduism and you supported the Banyas profit making politics, whether North or South, you belong to the same category. So I think for him, that structure was very, very important. The structure that kept alive the caste order and political Brahmanism. And Ambedkar also was not very different in that respect. As he argues in what Congress and Gandhi did. Earlier, the Brahmins took the support of the Kshatriyas. Today, they take the part of the Banyas and vice versa. And Ambedkar, of course, had a greater sense of the unity of the Indian nation than Periyar. For Periyar, Dravida Nadu, while it was an ideal society, he also felt that ideal society can be nurtured only in the Tamil context, in the Tamil world. And here he felt Tamil, historically, Tamilians had been opposed to Varnashrama Dharma and so on. Ambedkar was clear that the Hindus will not change their attitude towards caste and religion unless there's a crisis. When Periyar came a call to attacking Brahmins, was he creating such a crisis? That's a very interesting way of putting Periyar's call to to challenge Brahmins and Brahmanism. Yes, Periyar was certainly pushing for a crisis. He was pushing for a crisis at the where it mattered, because he felt that opinions and ideas in the modern world were being shaped by Brahmin intellectuals, and it was important to challenge them, not just the ones that were orthodox or old-fashioned, but even the progressive ones who would not take a position on the caste question or on the gender question, but who would speak of much else. So I think he was asking for a crisis to sort of emerge and within the Hindu social order. But equally, by asking for Dravida Nadi, he was trying to engineer a kind of a political crisis. And I think for Periyar, this sort of crisis was not very different from what Ambedkar wanted to institute when he called for Dalits to move away from Hinduism. Though I think the conversion, the dharmantar, when it happens, was not simply done to initiate a crisis, it was also a point of departure towards a new society. It was not simply a point of arrival. So I think the word crisis can be used in interesting ways as far as both of them are concerned. And mere change of government without changing the economic foundation of society would not be possible without equal representation to all castes, said Ambedkar. And Periyar talked about how a Bolshevik-like revolution had to happen. Yes, there is a common thread here, because both of them felt unless you challenge the caste inequality, which also is a class inequality, you cannot expect to have a socialist future. Periyar had this very interesting essay called "The Difference Between a Caste Worker and the Wage Worker." And this is something Ambedkar also spoke of a lot in the 1920s. A wage worker at least is valued, though he may be valued less in terms of the wages paid to him. He may not be valued fairly, but a wage is given to him for doing a piece of work. But the caste worker is supposed to do that work irrespective of whether he's paid a wage or not. And this is so true of bonded labor. And it is so true of the kinds of feudal servitude that you had in, say, in different parts of India, particularly the kind of servitude that the great Telangana armed struggle took against. And people joined the struggle not simply for better wages, but because it was against that precisely that kind of birth-based servitude. And this included both the Bahujans and Dalits. So yes, so they certainly wanted the caste-based understanding of labor to be taken on board and challenged as well. There is a common thread, therefore, and Ambedkar felt for Dalits it's good to move away from the village and to the city, even if they work in extremely difficult circumstances. Their labor is going to not be treated as servitude, and this is important. Caste divisions among Dalits and Bahujans weakening the find. Well, caste divisions at all levels have to be challenged, which is why we can't afford to forget Ambedkar's notion of fraternity. But fraternity is a work in progress, right? It's not going to happen overnight or anything. And that's a continuous fight for which one has to expend a lot of positive energy, create spaces where fraternity is possible, where fraternal relations can be sustained in the realms of art, of culture, in schools, in universities, reimagine the university. How would the university be reimagined from, say, the point of view of Dalits and Bahujans, which is what Rohit Vemula was asking for? And when we talk of reimagining the university, it's not simply about liberty of speech, of the university being a place where you can have dissenting views, but equally where you have the Dalit and the Bahujan bringing their experiences, their worldviews, their cultures to reimagine knowledge itself. So the reimagining the university can be a space where fraternity is also possible. This is what Rohit Vemula wanted. So building fraternal spaces, how do you build such fraternal spaces? So there's that. Given the success of the non-Brahmin castes in Tamil Nadu to uplift themselves, those in Maharashtra and rest of India, does it mean that the work of Ambedkar is largely unfinished as compared to Periyar? No, I would say, in fact, even Periyar's work is unfinished. That's how Periyar saw his life work. When he was interviewed at the age of 93, just the year of his death, and people asked him, "Are you happy with what you've done?" He said, "What have I done? I have tried to protest the existence of the caste order. But you know how difficult the task is? It is like trying to overturn a mountain using a lock of hair." This is the metaphor that Periyar uses. So fighting caste is a project that is by no means over. In the Tamil Nadu context, certain non-Brahmin castes, those that are numerically and economically dominant, have been able to access political power. Some leaders and thinkers who are convinced of Periyar's ideas about caste have been in sort of trying to use the powers of government to create a kind of equality of access to education and employment. And this is not only those that are there in the Dravidian parties, but equally someone like Kamaraj did that. Someone like Subbarayan earlier in the British period did that, and he was not in the Justice Party. So if you're convinced of Periyar, it wouldn't matter which party you were in. But if you're not convinced of Periyar, never mind if you're a non-Brahmin, you could still, like certain Dravidian parties, support a majoritarian project. So I think there are those complicated differences that we need to keep in mind. For Periyar, let's not forget the abolition of untouchability and the violence done to Dalits is a touchstone of justice and equality. If such violence and atrocities continue in present-day Tamil Nadu, access to power by a certain segment of the non-Brahmins is a partial such victory, but it certainly nowhere means the end of the caste order. So the Dravidian model can only be seen as a work in progress. And the progress is it's incremental. It is certainly not something that has been achieved. Who is better, Periyar or Ambedkar? I think you have to make that choice yourself. For me, this question is not something that perhaps is very useful. We may want to think of Periyar, Ambedkar, their forebears, and anyone else who is part of this project of what they both wanted. So I think those are the questions. We are at the end now, perhaps.
Other two are the compliments, madam.
What other questions are there? Have I missed something?
No, not questions. Compliments.
Yeah.
Excellent presentation.
Thanks. That's right.
And thanks a lot. Any praise is
one more question is there, ma'am.
Which one? Caste division.
Arun Shauri's book on Ambedkar.
I did start with that. I said others have done a better job of answering.
Can deal with the issue?
Gagarin, she has done it. She has completed it. Madam, can you give some references of what others' works would be critiquing Arun Shauri's work?
I can't offhand remark, but a number of people have done it, including Anand Teltumde has done it. Many others have done it. They've all done it in their books on Ambedkar, on the Ambedkarite movement. Ashok Gopal has done it recently. So a lot of people have done it. Yeah.
Okay. Gagarin, Mike, over to you.
Hello.
There's one more question in the YouTube. I'll just paste it, madam. You can answer that also. Gagarin. I'm just pasting it here. Yes,
Hello.
Yes, madam. Gagarin, just please wait. In Maharashtra, the same tradition shows the seeds of anti-castes. Phule was deeply influenced by Tukaram.
That's a very good question, a very useful question. The Dravidian movement as such looks to certain kinds of figures who are not quite like the Bhakti saints, but who have been a very strong opponents of the caste order and Brahmanism, like the Siddhas, the Tamil Siddhas, for example. And more recently in the modern period, Vallalar or Ramalinga Swami. But also, I think one of the things that from Periyar's time, people in the movement have tried to sort of draw inspiration from the Shramana tradition, from the writings of Thiruvalluvar, for example, who is seen widely as either a Jaina or a Buddhist writer. Though Periyar was also critical of Thiruvalluvar because he felt his take on gender was neither fair nor just, but then that's Periyar. But basically, there's also been an attempt to sort of look at Tamil literary history and see whom we could sort of claim for our present purposes. But nowhere like how there is a tendency in Maharashtra, for example, to draw from the Varkari or the Mahanubhava traditions. You don't have such a strong thing. Or like in Karnataka, where people look to Basavanna and others. You don't have that in Tamil.
Aside to that, madam, what was did Ramanuja had any influence on Periyar's work, his anti-caste movement of Ramanuja itself?
Well, earlier in the period, the Justice Party, the first non-Brahmin party, and Periyar himself in his early writings did reference Ramanujacharya as a great fighter against the caste order. But like Ambedkar, he would also go on to say, but what could any of them actually do? Because their ideas were in the realm of religion, and religion did not really affect the way society, ideas in the sphere of religion were not translated into social ideas. To translate into social ideas, you need to fight and organize on the streets. So, yeah, that's how they understood Ramanuja.
Madam, one more question only. I'll read it from the YouTube directly.
Yeah.
Though the person poses it not as a question, but thinking aloud here, wondering how the political movement initiated by Kanchiram can benefit from the thoughts of Periyar.
Well, I think one of the things is a kind of a very principled rejection of any kind of important role for those from the dominant caste, especially Brahmins. That's one thing that Periyar was fairly clear about. It was not any hostility towards individuals, but he felt the entitled communities ought not to be part of any Bahujan Dalit formation in terms of political representation. And I think any attempt to sort of forge alliances with those that stand for a very different ideology might not work out to the interests of the Bahujans or Dalits, as we have seen in Uttar Pradesh. There's one more question.
Yeah, can you please throw light on views of Ranganayakama?
Yeah, so this is very specific to Andhra and Tamil Nadu because Ranganayakama writes in Telugu, and she's from the far left, and she's written a very critical book on Ambedkar. It's neither basically taking off from Ambedkar's essay Buddha or Karl Marx and saying that Marx is what we should be following. Her book has been translated into Tamil, so some of us had a chance to go through it. I will admit I have not read it fully, but I must say that she's again quoted extremely randomly from Ambedkar, tried to put together arguments that are found over a long stretch of his writings. And secondly, there's an assumption that we have to take the socialist framework for granted and try and measure everybody through that framework. Now, what I have suggested in today's talk is how might we think along with Periyar and Ambedkar to re-visualize some things that we take for granted like nation building or socialism. Because they are offering us ways of rethinking the terms of the argument itself. So one of the things I would say is that Ranganayakama's views implicitly assume that the socialist model is complete and that you have to measure everybody by that model. What we are arguing for is nothing is complete yet. These are all voices that are strong and slow and have emerged over the last 100 years. And there is a lot that needs to be done, and we need to rethink almost everything. Everything has to be rethought, as feminists once said in the 70s. So that's how I would read it.
Jagaran, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, ma'am. It is really very wonderful session. As Shyam Munduru, he has given a message. Excellent presentation. Thanks to Anekdhara for organizing such a great speech. And Chanda Asani also told thanks a lot. Any praise is limited. So it means there are people who have felt that you have given new insights to the entire question. In fact, what is this called? Arun Shaur is worshipping of false gods. One or two words may be important to be told here. In fact, Arun Shaur raised a few questions like tradition and past. Tradition and past, we can only see depending upon the holistic view of the entire population. If 30% of Hindus are untouchables, and more than 50% of Hindus are the servile Shudras, according to our Shastras, what sort of common tradition and history we have? I am afraid that Arun Shauri, with all his scholarship, failed to see this particular contradiction in Indian history and culture and heritage. And the second thing is, there was not a single instance, not one single solitary instance in which Ambedkar participated in any activity connected with the struggle of struggle to free the country. This is what the quotation from Arun Shauri's worshipping of false gods. There was not a single instance, not one single solitary instance in which Ambedkar participated in any activity connected with the struggle to free the country. Unfortunately, Arun Shauri never paused and answered the question of Babasaheb Ambedkar when he asked, whose freedom is it? In fact, he told Mahatma Gandhi, I do not have my own country. I do not have motherland. A country in which the untouchables were treated as cats and dogs, not even cats and less than cats and dogs. How anybody who has got self-respect can claim this country as his or her motherland? Unfortunately, Mr. Shourie never tried to understand this agony of a person who is treated as untouchable in this country. And not only that, Shourie never passed to see more than 90% of the British machinery is from Indians. And RSS, up to 2001, I think, never raised the tricolor flag on its office, except on a couple of occasions. And Guru Golwalkar ridiculed Fit India movement as a small breeze which affected only a few trees. But we never treated them as either anti-national or they have not participated in the freedom movement. And the next thing is, Mr. Shourie never tried to identify the intangible. Dr. Ambedkar's contribution to the freedom struggle is mostly intellectual. For example, if Dadabhai Nauroji's poverty and un-British rule in India is treated as a great contribution to the freedom movement, how came Mr. Shourie forgot to consider Babasaheb Ambedkar's problem of rupee and other economic contributions and many constitutional contributions, and simply say he has not contributed anything to Indian movement? And similarly, the position of a person when Periyar put shoe garlands or chapel garlands in the statues of or murtis of Hindu gods, many people say that their sentiments were hurt. True, we agree. But at the same time, a person was forced by the same religion, his religion, to collect food from the garbage. Have not these people's sentiments hurt? This is a point to be pondered. So therefore, I want the people who raised this question, worshipping of false gods and the criticism of Shourie and his ilk, we have to see, or rather we have to go to the black question in America. When somebody asks the blacks, how do you give a lesson to whites? One girl appeared to have told, nothing, you need not do anything. Paint a white person black and then live in the streets of America. That is the best or rather worst punishment we can do to the whites in order to understand the black question. Similarly, in order to understand the caste question, one has to put himself in the shoe of a Shudra before the 1800s and now in the shoe of an untouchable for the last 2,500 years. This is what I thought of telling. Sorry for taking more time. Thanks a lot, ma'am. You have done a beautiful job.
Gagarin, small interruption. Ma'am, if you don't mind, there are two more questions which have come up.
Yeah, I saw them. I saw this. Yeah, let me very quickly answer.
Please, I have not seen this. Please.
No, I'll answer. Did the great men ever join their crusade against casteism and share a common platform? Yes, they did. Several occasions, in fact, in the 1940s. Ambedkar came to Tamil Nadu in the 1940s. He spoke in several places in the city. He shared a platform. Subsequently, Periyar accompanied Ambedkar to a conference on Buddhism in Kathmandu and in Rangoon and so on. And he endorsed Ambedkar's decision to convert. And I must say, from the 1930s, the Tamil self-respect movement kept up a running support for Ambedkar throughout the period of the Pune Pact. So that was quite clear that there was a lot of give and take on both sides. The second question is, how come there are castes? One second, let me read it off. If caste is a part of a Hindu system, how does it exist among Christians and Muslims? This is a question that we often wonder at and ask ourselves. I think one of the things is that, again, Ambedkar is very useful, and Periyar in a different way is very useful to understand this. While the Hindu religion provides sanction for caste, this is what Ambedkar says. No other religion sacralizes inequality. Nobody says that you are unequal because God wanted you to be unequal. There will be inequality in Christianity, Islam, and just about every faith there is. But nobody says Jesus wished you to be unequal, or the prophet wished you to be unequal. In Hinduism, that happens. So when Hindus convert, that sense of inequality that they have inherited over generations is retained as habit. Ambedkar uses the word mental habitude. And he says you don't have to read the Manu Dharma Shastra to behave exactly like Manu wants you to behave. Because basically it is something that has shaped centuries of living and relating to people. So even if you move to another religion, you continue to sort of follow caste practices, especially when it comes to marriage and property. You might still pray in the same space, you might visit each other's homes, might even eat in each other's homes. But when it comes to marriage and property, you break it. On the other hand, you also have, especially in South Indian Islam, of which Tamil Islam I know better than most things, I know that there's also been a breaking of endogamy in an everyday sense amongst Muslims who are from a certain OBC background and those who are from a Dalit background. And even if a marriage does happen, it is not held to be haram. It's not wrong. Locally, families might fight. So caste does not have any religious insistence or bearing in both these religions, which is why in Christianity, even if Christians practice caste, the church has a place for fighting caste. There's a constant fight on against caste within the church itself. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Any other questions, Ravi?
No. Please go ahead.
That's all.
Okay. Thanks a lot, ma'am. It is really a grand session. So we are eternally grateful to you to bring two great personalities onto the same days and they continue to live in our hearts. We will also approach you for any other inputs required for us to take our mission forward.
Thank you
in
so
fact,
much.
You have shown the photograph of both Periyar and Ambedkar in the first slide. We have to thank Shreya for making such a wonderful poster. It is really a wonderful poster with wonderful photograph. And our technical team, Sadiq, is doing a great job. Not only in clearing all possible hiccups here, but also putting our recorded versions on the YouTube. Our audience, not even a single person has gone. All of them are riveted to the system ever since they have joined. We have to thank them profusely. And definitely they keep on joining and encourage Anekdhara to organize more and more sessions. We'll also thank our advisors, well-wishers, and all these people. And it is a grand session. Thanks a lot.
I would like to thank Professor Kumkum Roy
and
for
introducing me to you. Next seminar is on last Sunday of November. It is on Vivekananda and taken by Govinda Krishnan V, who wrote a book on Vivekananda. The book's name is Vivekananda, the Philosopher of Freedom.
Thank you.
I request all the audiences not only to join, but bring more and more audience so that we can participate in the nation building in our own right. Thanks a lot, and thanks all of you.
Thank you.
Madam, you were saying something, Gagarin.
No, I just wanted to thank Professor Kumkum Roy for introducing me to you, because otherwise I wouldn't have known about this. She's on your advisory panel, right?
Yeah, madam. Yeah. Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. I close the live stream now. So we are away from the YouTube.